The dollar is more than money. It is the bloodstream of the global economy, the quiet architecture behind every trade route, every oil shipment, every national reserve, every multinational balance sheet. For nearly 8 decades, the world has lived inside a dollar-denominated reality, a system so vast and so deeply embedded that most people barely notice it. It's the invisible scaffolding holding modern capitalism upright. But what happens when that scaffolding starts to shake? What happens when the world's most powerful currency faces the one enemy it can never truly defeat: time? Today, we're going to explore a question usually reserved for the fringes of financial doomsday circles, but now whispered in central banks, boardrooms, and geopolitical summits. What happens when the dollar dies? This isn't a story about apocalypse. It's a story about power, how it's built, how it spreads, and how it fades. It's the story of the dollar as an empire. And like all empires, its decline doesn't begin with collapse. It begins with competition, with overreach, and with the slow erosion of trust. To understand where the dollar might be going, we have to understand how it became what it is, the most dominant currency in the history of the world. Act I: The birth of a monetary empire. The dollar's rise didn't begin with Wall Street or American innovation. It began with world wars that bankrupted Europe, shattered empires, and left the United States holding the only intact industrial machine on Earth. In 1944, as the Second World War neared its violent end, 44 nations gathered in a small New Hampshire resort called Bretton Woods. The goal was simple: rebuild the global financial system from scratch. They looked around the negotiating table. Britain was exhausted. France was devastated. Germany and Japan were in ruins. Only one country had gold, factories, and a functioning economy: the United States. So the world made a deal. The dollar would become the anchor of global trade. Every currency would peg itself to the dollar, and the dollar would peg itself to gold. America promised comfortability at $35 per ounce. It was a monetary version of divine right. The dollar became the king of currencies. But like every empire, the dollar's supremacy was not merely an economic construct. It was political. It was cultural. It was psychological. When nations saved in dollars, they were not just saving money, they were buying a ticket into the American-led world order. The Marshall Plan, the creation of the IMF and World Bank, the U.S. Navy patrolling global trade routes, Hollywood exporting American dreams everywhere, all of it reinforced the same message: trust the dollar and the world makes sense. But trust is a fragile thing, and gold, finite, inflexible, was a chain the U.S. economy would eventually outgrow. By the late 1960s, America was spending more than it earned on Vietnam, on welfare programs, on global commitments, stretching far beyond its fiscal reach. Dollars were flowing out faster than gold was flowing in. Europe began asking for their gold back. Nixon faced a choice: lose the gold or lose the dollar. He chose to sever the link. In 1971, he closed the gold window. The dollar was no longer backed by anything but faith, and that's when its real power began. Because instead of collapsing, the dollar reinvented itself. It didn't need gold. It had something better: oil. Act II: Petrodollar ascendancy. In 1973, amid the chaos of the Yom Kippur War and an oil embargo that shattered Western economies, the U.S. struck a quiet deal with Saudi Arabia. America would protect the Saudi monarchy militarily, politically, diplomatically. In return, Saudi Arabia would price all its oil in dollars. Soon, OPEC followed. Overnight, the dollar became more than a currency. It became an economic passport. If you wanted energy, you needed dollars. If you wanted to trade, you needed dollars. If you wanted to survive, you needed dollars. And so the world bought dollars, and bought U.S. bonds, and stored their savings in the heart of the American financial system. This petrodollar system created something unprecedented: a global demand for U.S. debt, which in turn allowed the U.S. to spend freely, run massive deficits, and project power across the world. An empire financed not by tribute, but by voluntary dependence. But all empires face the same two threats: overconfidence from within and ambition from without. And by the 21st century, both were closing in. Act III: Cracks in the dollar wall. The first crack came from America itself. After 2001, the U.S. accelerated into an era of exploding deficits, endless wars, bailouts, quantitative easing, near-zero interest rates, financialization of everything. The dollar survived these storms not because America was disciplined, but because the world had no alternative. Europe tried with the Euroboot. A sovereign debt crisis shattered that dream. Japan tried but drowned in deflation. BRICS nations talked but never coordinated. The dollar remained king, but the cracks widened. China, in particular, began preparing for a future where it would no longer accept dollar supremacy as a given. It built its own payment systems, stockpiled gold, and signed currency swap agreements with dozens of nations. Russia joined in. So did Iran. So did parts of Africa, Latin America, even Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, the U.S. deployed the most dangerous tool in its arsenal: financial sanctions, at a scale never seen before. Freezing Russian reserves in 2022 was a turning point. It told every nation on Earth, your savings are only safe if you never cross the United States. And suddenly, countries that once depended on the dollar started asking a forbidden question. What happens if we don't need it anymore? Act 4. The slow death of a reserve currency. Reserve currencies don't die quickly. They die slowly, then suddenly. The pattern is always the same. The economy overextends. Debt grows faster than production. Rivals rise. The currency remains dominant till trust breaks. The British pound followed this path after World War I. Before that, the Dutch guilder. Before that, the Spanish real. Before that, silver coins from Ming China. Every reserve currency's reign ends. Not because it collapses, but because the world changes. The question is not if the dollar will lose its throne. The question is how. So let's map the possibilities. Scenario 1. The peaceful decline in this future. The dollar doesn't die. It simply becomes one currency among many still important, but not dominant. Global trade gradually shifts into yuan for Asia, euro for Europe, rupees or dirhams for regional blocs, commodities priced in multiple currencies. Digital central bank coins for cross-border settlement. The U.S. remains a major power, but no longer the financial center of the universe. What changes? America would face higher borrowing costs, weaker global demand for U.S. bonds, shrinking ability to run massive deficits, a military force to downsize, lower global influence. This is a soft landing, painful but manageable. But history suggests reserve currencies rarely fade so gently. Scenario 2. In this scenario, China, Russia, and BRICS nations accelerate their alternatives. Oil producers sell energy in yuan, rupees, and euros. Africa and Latin America shift reserves into gold and non-dollar currencies. Europe builds its own payment architecture immune to U.S. sanctions. Central banks quietly diversify away from treasuries. The dollar doesn't collapse, but demand steadily declines. This creates turbulence, volatile exchange rates, fragmented trade systems, capital flight, financial instability across emerging markets. It's not the end of the dollar, just the end of dollar monopoly. For the United States, this is the most realistic path, a slow erosion of privilege. Scenario 3. The sudden shock. This is the nightmare scenario. It doesn't require conspiracy. It only requires a trigger, something that breaks confidence in the dollar's future. A trigger like a U.S. debt crisis. A government shutdown that spirals a treasury default. Even technical. A geopolitical conflict involving the USA collapse. In confidence in the Federal Reserve, rapid de-dollarization. By oil producers, a digital currency displacing the dollar in trade. If trust cracks, global investors flee. The dollar falls. Treasury yields spike. The U.S. government becomes unable to finance its deficits. Inflation surges. The Fed loses control. This isn't just an economic event, it's geopolitical. The U.S. projects power through financial dominance, lose that, and the world changes overnight. This is not probable tomorrow, but it becomes more probable every time debt rises faster than GDP, every time the political system grows more dysfunctional, every time the dollar is used as a weapon. Act 5. The world after the dollar. So, what does a post-dollar world actually look like? Let's imagine it carefully, realistically, and without sensationalism. 1. Trade fragmentation. Global trade stops being a single, integrated network. Instead, it becomes a cluster of rival blocs, each with its own clearing systems. The world resembles something closer to the 19th century regional economic spheres, competing for influence. 2. Reserve diversification. Central banks hold yuan, euros, rupees, gold, digital currencies. The U.S. loses its greatest advantage, the the ability to issue the world's reserve asset at will. 3. Higher U.S. interest rates without foreign buyers, U.S. debt becomes more expensive. Interest payments already, the fastest growing part of the budget, explode. The U.S. government faces impossible choices: cut spending, raise taxes, print money, or inflate away the debt. 4. Shrinking American military footprint. The U.S. Navy's global dominance is financed by dollar seigniorage the rest of the world effectively subsidizes it by storing wealth in U.S. bonds. Remove that, and America must live within its means. Bases close, operations shrink. Allies hedge, power redistributes. 5. The end of free money capitalism for decades. The U.S. economy has been built on cheap borrowing, zero interest rates, tech bubbles, real estate bubbles, government stimulus. A post-dollar world ends that era. Capital becomes expensive, speculation shrinks, financial discipline returns forcefully. 6. The rise of commodity-backed trade, oil, gas, minerals, agriculture. These become the backbone of settlement systems. The new reality resembles a modernized version of the gold standard, but powered by energy and metals rather than gold bars. 7. Geopolitical realignment. Nations previously tied to the U.S. orbit shift toward regional powers. Europe hedges between Washington and Beijing. The Middle East pivots east. Africa aligns with whoever brings investment. Latin America forms its own alliances. The world becomes messier, less predictable, and more dangerous. Act Vi, does the dollar really die? Here's the truth. Reserve currencies do not die in the dramatic way people imagine. The dollar is not going to turn to dust. It's not going to disappear. It's not going to become worthless. What death means is this: the dollar stops being indispensable. It stops being the default. It stops being everyone's savings account. It stops being the price tag for global commodities. It stops being the unquestioned center of global finance. The dollar dies not when it collapses, but when it becomes optional. And in many parts of the world, that transition has already begun. Act 7. America's choice, the future of the dollar, is not inevitable. It depends on decisions the United States makes or fails to make in the coming decade. The dollar will remain dominant if America stabilizes its deficits, invests in domestic production, restores trust in its institutions, avoids weaponizing finance, leads in technological and industrial innovation, rebuilds alliances through cooperation rather than coercion. But the dollar will decline if America continues unsustainable borrowing, turns inward, politically fractures its social cohesion, relies solely on military dominance, underestimates the rise of rival financial systems. Empires do not fall because rivals rise. Empires fall because they fail to adapt. The dollar's fragility is not a story about China or BRICS or gold. It's a story about America's ability to reinvent itself economically, politically, socially. That is the real variable. Act 8. The psychological shift. The most important moment in the death of a currency is not financial, it's psychological. It's the moment the world collectively decides, we don't trust this anymore. That moment is invisible until it's too late. It doesn't show up on charts. It doesn't announce itself. It creeps. It starts with small decisions. A country trading in yuan instead of dollars, a central bank adding more gold to reserves, a corporation using alternative payment rails, oil priced in multiple currencies individually. These mean nothing. Collectively, they form a trend, and trends become destiny. The dollar dominated because the world believed in it. It will decline when that belief fades. Act 9. The final irony. Here's the greatest irony of all. The dollar may die, not because America weakens, but because the world grows up. For decades, global trade has been like a river with one mouth. Everything eventually flowed through the United States, but now new rivers are forming. Asia is rising. Africa is rising. Latin America is rising. The Middle East is transforming. Technology is decentralizing power. Digital currencies are bypassing traditional systems. The world is simply too big, too fast, and too interconnected for one country's currency to serve as its anchor. The dollar's decline may be less a tragedy and more a natural evolution in economy, globalizing beyond the control of any single nation. Conclusion: the end of privilege, not the end of the world. So what happens when the dollar dies? The world does not end. The United States does not collapse. Global trade does not freeze. Instead, America becomes a normal country, not an exceptional one. The world becomes multipolar, not unipolar. Trade becomes diversified, not centralized. Power becomes distributed, not monopolized. The dollar's death is not an event. It is a transition from one world order to the next. And in that transition lies uncertainty, instability, and opportunity. Because when an old system cracks, a new one can finally emerge. What comes after the dollar may be messier, more complex, less predictable. But it may also be more balanced, more democratic, and more reflective of the world as it actually is. The dollar's reign was long. Its shadow is deep. But no currency rules forever. And the question we must ask now is not what happens when the dollar dies, but rather, are we ready for the world that follows?